Well, good afternoon. The purpose of this press conference is to advise of some minor changes that have occurred as a result of directions meeting this morning, and also consideration of some of the queries we're receiving from the community regarding community and club sport. So firstly, in terms of the Directions Committee, a decision was made this morning that now prevents people from transiting through Sydney Airport to South Australia. Any person who travels from certain parts of Australia through Sydney to South Australia will be required to quarantine at home for 14 days and undergo the day 1, 5 and 13 testing during that 14-day period. This is on the basis that with the number of daily cases being reported in New South Wales, we don't have any confidence that transiting passengers can maintain a sterile corridor as they're transiting through the Sydney Airport, and also the potential to be travelling on an aircraft with people from New South Wales who may have been from high-risk locations. This particularly may affect people who are currently in regional Queensland, who at this point in time are not required to quarantine when coming home to South Australia. So people in regional Queensland who may travel through the Sydney Airport, effective immediately, will be required to quarantine for 14 days. It is our understanding that there are no currently scheduled flights from Queensland through Sydney to South Australia, so this should not have any adverse impact on people who are currently in transit. Anybody in regional Queensland will need to revisit their travel plans to make sure that they're not affected by this change of direction, which has taken effect this afternoon. The other change that's been made to the directions, the public activities directions, is clarification around spectators at community and club sports. The physical distancing requirement of 1 person per 2 square metres is going to be applied up to a total number of 1,000 people at community or club sporting activities, outdoor events only, on the provision that people watching the sporting activity are wearing masks. SA Health are to provide further advice in relation to indoor sporting competitions, as there is a greater risk of infection transmission in indoor venues compared to outdoors. So this should provide some clarification and relief to people who wish to watch their local sporting clubs participate in competitions over the next weekend. But the reminder is spectators should be wearing masks, they must be physically distanced at 1 person per 2 square metres, and seated consumption applies at sporting activities as well. Any questions?
Has there been any consideration given to changing the restrictions with the rest of Queensland? I know travellers arriving today were nervous about that.
Well, we've put the very strong advice out to people who are currently South Australian residents who are currently in Queensland, that they should make every effort to return home as quickly as possible. We simply cannot guarantee that the restrictions for regional Queensland are not going to be increased, and those people may find themselves having to quarantine for 14 days, or if things do deteriorate substantially, they may find they have to apply for an exemption to return to South Australia. So we're giving advance notice to these people. That advice was given yesterday. In fact, the first messaging went out on Sunday afternoon, advising people of the deteriorating situation in Queensland. So we're hopeful that people have heeded that message and that this won't catch people out if we do have to upgrade those restrictions. There are no conversations at this point in time to do that, but we are closely monitoring the situation in Queensland.
What will it take to flip that switch and include all of Queensland?
The sorts of things that we've considered for other jurisdictions, it will be the number of community transmission cases and whether or not those community transmission cases are currently in quarantine, the number of high-risk locations that might arise from that community transmission, and the number of close contacts, particularly if there are concerns about having been able to track down those close contacts, and whether the virus transmission extends into regional Queensland. These are things we simply can't forecast. We need to see what actually occurs and then assess that information on a day-by-day basis.
Commissioner, when do the new rules come into force from?
The sporting competition spectator changes will take effect as at the same time as the current direction as it's being drafted, which will be 1 minute past midnight on Thursday morning. The changes in relation to transiting through Sydney Airport have already taken effect. They were effective immediately on me signing that direction just after 1 o'clock this afternoon.
And can I, what's your position in terms of the restrictions that you announced yesterday? Are we still looking to introduce them all as of 1 minute past midnight on Thursday?
That's setting course. The team are working on the direction as we speak. and that should be ready for my signature at some point prior to that. So there will be no changes at this point in time to the notification that was provided yesterday to the public activities. We're on track to implement that as of 1 minute past midnight on Thursday.
Can I just get some clarification? There seems to be some confusion about the rules. You know, one person for 2 square metres compared to, say, standing up, drinking or seated consumption. Can you clarify what either the health advice or the thought process was from the committee yesterday about having those 2 different sets of rules?
Well, they're different things. Density requirements restricts the number of people who can be inside a venue, and that minimises the risk of transmission. We understand the impact that has on small business, but the requirement for hospitality is that you must be seated to consume food or beverages, and it's about the minimising of movement within those venues whilst they have people inside. So they are 2 different requirements that are put upon hospitality particularly, and that will come into effect as of 12:01 a.m. on Thursday morning.
And what's the latest health advice?
We only had a directions meeting this morning to discuss the issue with Sydney. I haven't had an update in relation to Queensland today, but we'll obviously SA Health are monitoring very closely what's occurring there. We'll be speaking again tomorrow, I would imagine, and we'll assess what's occurred in New South Wales and Queensland at that time.
Commissioner, this one's from the Sports Department. Showdown, do we have an update on that?
The Sports Department will need to go to SA Health. SA Health manage those events that fall under the banner of a COVID management plan. I do know that SA Health are working with the stadium and the AFL about the showdown on the weekend. I'm not part of that conversation. I would imagine there will be crowds at the showdown, but I have no specific information about what that crowd number would look like.
When can we expect the rules for indoor sporting events?
SA Health are working on that now, so our endeavour is to provide information to the community as quickly as possible. There are some complications around the different types of indoor sporting venues that may accommodate sporting competitions and spectators, and I think it's generally acknowledged that indoor venues, there's a greater risk of transmission because of the enclosed environment, potentially shared space and recirculated air through air conditioning systems. So, knowing that we have sporting competitions happening this weekend, we know we can move forward on the outdoor competitions, and they're doing further work on indoor competitions at the moment.
The Royal Show has put out tickets today to the event. What restrictions will be placed on the Royal Show, and how much will police be required to monitor distancing, especially in Sideshow Alley?
Once again, without sounding like I'm avoiding the question, SA Health will be working with the Royal Agricultural and Horticultural Society on a COVID management plan in an effort to make sure that the Royal Show can be conducted in a safe way. SA Police will be at the show as we are every single year. We have an additional set of responsibilities this time round in relation to making sure the show is conducted in a COVID safe way, not just a community safety perspective. So it'll be based on the discussions between SA Health and the Society as to what comes out of that, so I don't have any particular insights on that.
Commissioner, last week when you introduced the new restrictions, after the lockdown there was a cap on the number of people who could take people, say, to sports training, and then there was obviously the restrictions on spectators. What's changed the mindset in allowing 1 per 2 square metre density up to 1,000 people?
I think had we had more time to reflect on all of the implications of the current situation in South Australia coming out of the Modbury cluster and the threats we face from New South Wales and now Queensland, we may have landed on this prior to the announcement yesterday. But it was, as I said yesterday, it was quite a lengthy transition committee meeting, and we had a number of significant items on our agenda. This was one that was made it was made at a time when we were backed up against a press conference to ensure that we provided advice to the community. Further reflection and more time has enabled us to land on this position that I think will provide a great deal of relief to people within the community about attending sporting events, watching their kids play footy or tennis or netball over the weekend. So it's just a good thing we can do, and one that we would have done earlier had we had more time.
And was this one of the aspects in which the committee's overall advice to you was potentially in conflict with the health advice?
I wouldn't say there was any conflict over this. It was one of the dot points in a long list of items that needed to be addressed, and it probably we ran out of time to properly address it, and it was the approval of sporting competitions to commence was of a greater priority than the minutiae in relation to the number of people who could be present. We're correcting that now, making sure people have plenty of advance notice that they can go along and watch sport.
And Victoria, was there any further discussions this morning about the potential easing of the border rules with Greater Melbourne to, say, regional Victoria?
No. So this morning was a directions meeting, and directions meetings are held when we feel that there is a present risk to the South Australian community and we need to consider further restrictions. The outcome of that is the decision to not permit transit through Sydney. So that's imposing a further restriction. The Transition Committee is charged with the responsibility of finding a pathway out of restrictions, and the Transition Committee will be meeting on Thursday, and I would imagine that we'll be reconsidering the Victorian border situation during that meeting.
Commissioner, just on vaccines, we've seen Northern Adelaide is behind in vaccine statistics. Do you believe it's time for younger people to get vaccinated?
That's a question you should direct to SA Health. They have full responsibility for the vaccine rollout. That's not something SA Police are directly involved in.
And just on ambulance staff, obviously they have to comply with the red zone direction. Would police officers have to comply with that moving forward?
All police officers that work in the red zone or the sterile corridor are required to be vaccinated. Police officers who elect not to be vaccinated are transferred to other duties, and we replace those with police officers who are vaccinated. We've already got that in place.
And how's that going currently in terms of are all police officers vaccinated?
Well, not all police officers are vaccinated, but all police officers working in the red zone are vaccinated.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Thanks,
See you.
Commissioner.